In the Oliveira household, located in a quiet neighborhood in São Paulo, the family atmosphere was far from peaceful. Barbara, a 32-year-old architect who had been married to Lucas for 5 years, was constantly tense with her mother-in-law, Dona Marlene. What should have been a welcoming home had turned into an emotional battlefield. That Sunday, as usual, Dona Marlene arrived for family lunch. Barbara, busy in the kitchen, heard her mother-in-law's sharp tone echo through the house. "Lucas, my son, you're so thin. That wife of yours isn't taking good care of you." Barbara, already accustomed to criticism, took a deep breath before responding. "Lucas is fine, the doctor said he's at his ideal weight." Without wasting any time, Dona Marlene retorted, "Oh, what do these doctors know? A mother always knows what's best." Shortly after, Dona Marlene entered the kitchen, her eyes scanning the room for something to criticize. "Barbara, my dear, isn't this kitchen a bit messy? In my day, we kept everything spotless." Lucas, trying to avoid an argument, intervened. "Mom, please, Barbara works all day and still makes an incredible lunch every Sunday." His mother-in-law, however, did not give up. "In my day, women knew how to balance everything, work and home. But nowadays..." Barbara struggled to remain calm. Lunch continued in a tense silence, broken only by Dona Marlene's comments about how the rice was dry or the chicken could have been cooked longer. After the meal, while Barbara was clearing away the plates, Dona Marlene took the opportunity to bring up a common subject. "Son, have you ever thought about giving me grandchildren? I'm not getting any younger." Lucas sighed, already tired of that conversation. "Mom, Barbara and I decided to wait a little longer." Irritated, the mother-in-law wasted no time in making a dig. "Wait until she can't have any more children? Or does she not even want to give you grandchildren?" This time, Barbara couldn't contain herself and entered the room. "With all due respect, Mrs. Marlene, this is a decision between me and Lucas. You have no right to interfere in our lives." The mother-in-law, indignant, replied, "I only want the best for my son, something that you clearly don't want." Lucas, realizing that the situation was getting out of hand, tried to calm things down. "Mom, Barbara is right, this is our choice." With a look of deep disappointment, Mrs. Marlene replied, "I see that you chose your side, Lucas. I hope you don't regret it." And she left, slamming the door, leaving a heavy silence in the air. Filled with pent-up emotions and accumulated resentments, Barbara sank onto the couch, silent tears streaming down her face. Lucas, by her side, hugged her in silence. They knew that this scene would repeat itself the following Sunday, and the following, in a seemingly endless cycle of family conflicts. Later, lying next to Lucas, Barbara couldn't sleep. Her mind was filled with memories of the countless humiliations she had endured from Dona Marlene over the years. She wondered how much more she could take and if her marriage would survive her mother-in-law's constant interference. Little did she know that even more intense events were about to happen, changing the course of their lives forever. That Tuesday, which began like any other, fate decided to intervene. Barbara, who had taken the day off to take care of some pending matters at home, had no idea what was coming. The shrill sound of the doorbell broke the silence of the afternoon, making her stomach churn. She already knew who it was before she even opened the door. "Good afternoon, Barbara," Dona Marlene greeted with feigned sweetness. "Lucas asked me to stop by to pick up some documents he forgot." Barbara frowned, surprised. "That's strange, he didn't tell me anything." "Oh, dear, he must have forgotten. You've been so busy lately," Dona Marlene replied, entering the house uninvited. Barbara took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure. "What documents would those be? Maybe I can help you find them." With a gesture of disdain, her mother-in-law replied, "Don't worry, I know this house better than you. I'll take a look at the office." Before Barbara could stop her, Dona Marlene was already rummaging through the drawers. The tension in the air was palpable. "Mrs. Marlene, please don't touch our things without permission," Barbara said, her voice thick with restrained anger. Her mother-in-law turned around, her eyes flashing. Without permission. I'm Lucas' mother, I have every right to be here. That sentence was the last straw. Years of frustration boiled over in Barbara. No, you don't. This is my and Lucas' house. You can't just come in and do whatever you want. Mrs. Marlene's mouth fell open for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. How dare you talk to me like that? Barbara, without backing down, continued, I won't tolerate this anymore. You need to get out of my house now. Mrs. Marlene took a step forward, pointing an accusing finger. You can't throw me out. But suddenly her voice broke. She put her hand to her chest, her eyes wide with shock and pain. Barbara watched in horror as her mother-in-law staggered and dropped a stack of books. Mrs. Marlene, she called, her voice now filled with concern. But her mother-in-law did not respond. She collapsed to the floor, still clutching her chest, breathing heavily. For a few seconds, Barbara stood paralyzed, unable to comprehend what was happening. When she finally managed to move, it was as if she were in slow motion, kneeling beside Ms. Marlene. Barbara's heart was beating fast as she tried to call Marlene. Mrs. Marlene, what are you feeling? Her mother-in-law seemed distant, her eyes fixed on something Barbara couldn't see. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. A storm of conflicting emotions took hold of Barbara. Fear and worry, of course, but to her surprise, a small satisfaction appeared in the back of her mind. A dark voice whispered, finally, this will be over. She felt immediately disgusted for thinking that way, but the thought was already there, impossible to ignore. I need to call an ambulance, she murmured, more to herself than to Marlene. However, before she could move, a new idea crossed her mind, what if I wait a little longer? Maybe this is destiny, saving us from years of suffering. She stood there, caught between moral dilemma and indecision, while time seemed to drag on. Every second of hesitation could be vital to Marlene's life, but Barbara couldn't move. The silence in the room, broken only by her mother-in-law's irregular breathing, seemed deafening. Looking at Marlene's face contorted in pain, Barbara found herself torn between being the victim or the villain in this situation. She realized that any decision she made at that moment would not only determine Marlene's future, but would also alter the course of her own life and marriage forever. The room seemed suspended in time, while Barbara remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the figure in front of her. I should call for help, she murmured again, her voice barely audible. However, her feet seemed rooted to the ground. An inner voice, which she would never have believed she had, whispered, what if you don't do this? Barbara shook her head, frightened by her own thoughts. No, this is wrong, she murmured, but the voice persisted, she has done you so much harm, humiliation and criticism, maybe it is fate repaying you. Tears began to form in her eyes as she fought against these dark thoughts. She knelt beside Marlene, watching her mother-in-law's pain-stricken face. Mrs. Marlene, can you hear me? She called softly, hoping to get an answer. Marlene's eyes opened slightly, focusing with difficulty on Barbara, but nothing was said. In that instant, guilt took over Barbara, questioning how she could even consider not helping her. That would make her as cruel as her mother-in-law had always accused her of being. Determined, Barbara stood up to pick up the phone, but hesitated once more. What if I just wait a little longer? She began to think again. Her internal conflict intensified as she paced back and forth. If I call now, nothing will change. She will recover and continue to torment us. Barbara stopped abruptly, shocked by the direction of her thoughts. My God, what is happening to me? I am not like this, she thought, horrified. She looked at the clock on the wall. Only 5 minutes had passed since Dona Marlene had fallen, but it felt like hours. Every second of indecision weighed on her conscience. She turned her gaze to Marlene, who now remained motionless, her eyes closed. A fear took hold of Barbara, believing that perhaps it was already too late. Dona Marlene, she called in a trembling voice, please open your eyes." To her relief, Marlene let out a weak moan, and her eyes slowly opened. In that instant, Barbara knew what she had to do. She ran to grab the phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed the emergency number. "Emergency, what's the problem?" The voice of the operator sounded on the other end of the line, making Barbara hesitate for a brief second. "I need an ambulance, my mother-in-law is having a heart attack," she replied, her voice shaking. As she gave the details, a mixture of relief and regret washed over her. Relief that she had finally made the right decision. Regret that she had even considered not doing something for a moment. After hanging up the phone, she returned to Dona Marlene's side. "Help is on the way," she said, holding her mother-in-law's hand. "Everything is going to be okay." However, as she waited for the ambulance, she couldn't shake the thought that her hesitation could have serious consequences. What if those moments of doubt had cost Marlene her life? How could she live with herself knowing that for a brief moment she had considered not helping? The distant sound of sirens brought Barbara back to reality. She took a deep breath, preparing herself for what was to come. She knew that she would have to deal not only with the emergency, but also with the guilt and moral dilemma that her actions, or lack thereof, had triggered. As the sirens grew closer, Barbara looked at Marlene and whispered, "Forgive me." It wasn't clear whether she was asking for forgiveness for her hesitation to help or for the years of resentment she'd harbored. Maybe it was both. The minutes that passed, dark and tense, would forever change the way Barbara saw herself. She knew that no matter the outcome, nothing would ever be the same. The shrill sound of the sirens was still echoing down the street when the front door burst open. Lucas ran in, his face pale and sweaty. "Mom," he shouted, looking around for answers. Barbara, who was in the hallway following the paramedics who were carrying Marlene on the stretcher, turned in surprise. "Lucas, how did you?" "The neighbor called me. I saw the ambulance and ran," Lucas interrupted, quickly approaching. "What happened? Is my mother okay?" The weight of guilt fell on Barbara like a blow. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure how to explain the situation without revealing her indecision. "She had a heart attack," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "We were in the office when it happened." Lucas's face grew even paler. "My God, why didn't you call me?" Lucas's question hit Barbara like an unexpected blow. She tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come out. Before she could react, one of the paramedics approached. "Sir, your mother is stabilized, but we need to take her to the hospital now. Would you like to ride in the ambulance with her?" Lucas nodded, but before leaving, he glanced at Barbara, full of concern and a hint of distrust. "We'll talk later," he said, his tone colder than Barbara had ever heard. When Lucas left with the paramedics, Barbara remained motionless in the hallway, feeling completely disoriented. The silence that followed the ambulance's departure was suffocating. A few minutes passed until she finally moved, walking with heavy steps to the couch, where she collapsed, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The reality of what had happened, and what had almost happened, was beginning to weigh on her. "What did I do?" she whispered to herself, as the tears began to roll. How could I have hesitated? How am I going to tell Lucas this? The hours that followed were a blur of anxiety and guilt. Barbara alternated between uncontrolled sobs and moments of total apathy. She checked her cell phone repeatedly, waiting for a message from Lucas, but the silence on the phone only increased her anguish. It was already night when the front door finally opened. Lucas came in, his face marked by exhaustion. Barbara got up from the couch, her heart racing. "Lucas," she began, her voice weak, how is she?" He looked at her for a long time before answering, "She'll survive. The doctors said it was a close call. If help had waited a few more minutes." He didn't finish the sentence, but the weight of his words hit Barbara like a shock. That moment of indecision could have cost Dona Marlene her life. "Lucas, Barbara tried to speak, but he interrupted her, why didn't you call me right away?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Why did I have to find out from the neighbor?" Barbara felt the tears come back. I panicked. "It all happened so fast," she answered, her voice shaking. Lucas watched her with an intensity that seemed to pierce her, as if trying to understand what was behind her words. "There's something you're not telling me, isn't there?" he asked, his voice serious and firm. The silence that followed was oppressive. Barbara knew that this was the decisive moment. She could lie and say she did everything she could, or be honest and risk losing everything. "Lucas," she began, her voice shaking, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I almost did." Lucas's gaze narrowed, a mixture of fear and confusion in his eyes. "Almost did what?" Barbara took a deep breath, gathering the courage to tell the truth that was tormenting her. She knew that her next words could change her life and her marriage forever. "When your mother had the heart attack," she began, struggling to keep her voice steady, I hesitated to call the ambulance." The silence that followed her confession was devastating, filled with shock and disbelief. Now the fate of her marriage and her life as she knew it lay in Lucas's hands, depending on how he reacted to this heartbreaking revelation. Lucas's phone rang, and he hesitated before answering. "Hello?" "Yes, it's me." "What?" "But how?" "I understand. Let's go as fast as we can." When he hung up, his face reflected a mixture of concern and bewilderment. "It's the hospital," he said, his voice tense. "My mother woke up, but she's agitated. They said she's asking to speak to me, and you, Barbara." A shiver ran through Barbara at the mention of her name. "Me? But why?" "I don't know," Lucas replied, clearly uncomfortable. "But we need to go. This conversation." He gestured vaguely between them. "It'll have to wait." The drive to the hospital passed in silence, each of them immersed in their own thoughts. Barbara felt the weight of the truth that had not yet been revealed, while Lucas seemed lost in his own worries. When they arrived at Donna Marlene's room, they were surprised by her image, now weakened and connected to several machines, but her eyes, despite this, shone with an intensity that seemed to be at odds with her condition. "Lucas." "Barbara." She called, her voice weak but urgent. "Come here. I need to tell you something." They exchanged restless glances as they approached the bed. "Mom, you need to rest," Lucas began. "Whatever it is, it can wait." "No." Donna Marlene exclaimed, with unexpected strength. "This can't wait. I almost died today and I realized that I can't leave this world carrying this secret." Barbara's heart raced. What secret could be so important? Donna Marlene took a deep breath before continuing. "Lucas, you are not your father's son." The revelation fell like a bombshell. Lucas stood still for a moment, before staggering and leaning against the wall, struggling to stay on his feet. What? What are you talking about, Mom?" Mrs. Marlene closed her eyes, gathering her strength. "Before I married your father, I had a relationship with Barbara's father." The silence that followed was crushing. Barbara felt the ground disappear beneath her feet, unable to process the words. This can't be true," she whispered, her voice shaking. "My father, he never." "He didn't know," Mrs. Marlene interrupted. "No one knew. Only me. I found out I was pregnant right after we broke up, and then I met Lucas's father. I let everyone believe the child was his." Lucas, who had remained silent until then, finally asked, "Why are you telling us this now?" "Because I almost died today," Mrs. Marlene replied, tears in her eyes. "And I realized I couldn't leave without telling the truth. You deserve to know." She then turned her gaze to Barbara, a mixture of sadness and understanding. "And you, Barbara, now I understand why I was always so hard on you. You reminded me so much of your father, the man I truly loved." Seeing you with Lucas was like reliving what could have been, if I had faced the truth years ago. The tears began to roll down Barbara's face, the emotional confusion taking over. All the resentment she felt for Dona Marlene began to be replaced by an avalanche of feelings that she could barely comprehend. Lucas, in turn, seemed stunned. So, Barbara and I are half-siblings. The realization weighed heavily on the air, on everyone in the room. Their marriage, the love they shared, now seemed tainted by this devastating revelation. Dona Marlene nodded, as the gravity of her words continued to reverberate between them. Yes, and I'm so sorry for keeping this to myself for so long. I thought I was protecting you, but now I realize I've only caused more suffering. The silence that followed was thick, filled with conflicting emotions and unanswered questions. Barbara looked at Lucas, seeing in him the same confusion and pain she felt. What do we do now? She whispered, more to herself than to the others. Lucas shook his head, lost. I don't know. This changes everything. Dona Marlene watched the two of them, her expression a mix of regret and relief. I know it's a lot to take in, but you deserve to know the truth. Only then will you be able to decide what to do from now on. The heart monitor next to the bed emitted a constant sound, while the three of them remained there, in an unsettling silence, each immersed in their own thoughts. The revelation not only unraveled the past, but also obscured the future. What once seemed like a common family dispute now turned out to be a web of secrets, lies and forbidden love. Barbara, remembering her reluctance to help Dona Marlene hours earlier, realized that life was much more complicated than she had ever imagined. The boundaries between right and wrong, love and hate, family and strangers suddenly blurred together in a confusing way. As night fell over the hospital, the three remained there, bound by a secret that would change their lives forever. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. What about you? What would you do in Barbara and Lucas's place? This shocking revelation changed everything. If this story of family secrets, forbidden loves and moral dilemmas impacted you as much as it did me, leave a like right now. Comment on what you think will happen to this couple. Will their love be strong enough to overcome this discovery? Don't miss the next episodes of this captivating plot. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to be notified whenever a new chapter is released. Until next time. And remember, sometimes, the truth can be more surprising than fiction. You were never good enough for my Lucas. I always knew that you just wanted to keep him away from me. The words cut Barbara like a blade. Keep him away. You never accepted that he grew up, that he now has his own life. Life? What life? Working too much, without children, married to a woman who doesn't even know how to cook. Dona Marlene retorted, her face flushed with anger. Barbara felt the tears of frustration welling up. Enough. And if you liked this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like it and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. A big kiss and see you in the next exciting story.